They never thought it could happen. For decades, the United States believed one thing was unshakable, that China would always need its soybeans, but overnight the ships stopped coming, the contracts vanished, silos across the Midwest filled to the roof with crops that had nowhere to go. And while America waited for China to come back, China was already building a new world without it. New farms in Brazil, new irrigation networks in Africa, new rail routes in Argentina, new scientific labs at home creating super yield soybeans of its own. China wasn't negotiating, it was replacing. The shock wasn't just agricultural, it was psychological. The message was unmistakable. Food security is power, and China will never depend on a rival to feed itself. By the time Washington realized what was happening, it was too late. The world had shifted, new suppliers rose, new alliances formed. The United States lost not a customer, but its economic leverage. And the most unsettling question began echoing through every hole of power. If China can walk away from American soybeans, what or who will it walk away from next?
America's largest and most valuable export to China, do you know what it is? Soybeans. Well, they have crashed to zero because of President Trump's trade war. Farmers are feeling the pain big time, and the Trump administration could announce a more than $10 billion bailout this week. But farmers tell Janet Shamlian their problems are much bigger than that.
Right now, in the middle of America, farmers are facing a financial disaster they never saw coming. They've just harvested a massive crop of over 4 billion bushels of soybeans. But instead of a payday, they're facing a crisis. Why? Because at the exact moment they need to sell, their number one customer, China, which usually buys about 60% of all US soybean exports, has suddenly stopped buying. This isn't a small market dip. This is a collapse. The price for a bushel of soybeans has crashed from over $13 to near $11, pushing it far below the $12.50 that many farmers need just to break even.
One of the things I want is China's going to buy soybeans. I want China to stop with the fentanyl. I don't want them to play the rare earth game with us.
But you want them to, but do you think they will make a deal on soybeans?
I do believe, yeah, because otherwise I'm not going to make a deal. No, I want them to buy. Our farmers have been boycotted by China, and in particular our soybean farmers, and I want them to start buying soybeans at least in the amount that they were buying before. And I believe they'll be able to do that. Right now, China's paying a tremendous amount of money in tariffs. They'd be paying about 157% tariff, which is, record-setting type tariff. They probably can't pay that much, and I'm okay with that. We can lower that, but they have to do things for us too. It's no longer a one-way street.
The first signs appeared quietly. Cargo ships that once sailed weekly from American ports toward Chinese harbors were suddenly delayed, then quietly canceled. Warehouses in Iowa and Illinois overflowed with soybean mountains that normally would have vanished across the Pacific. At first, U.S. news anchors blamed weather, shipping, congestion, and paperwork. But the truth was bigger, deeper, and more strategic than anyone wanted to admit. China had stopped buying U.S. soybeans, not reduced, not slowed, stopped in the government offices of Washington. Diplomats insisted it was a temporary negotiation tactic. Analysts insisted China would return because it needed the supply. But while politicians argued on television, Chinese trade representatives were traveling not to the United States, but to Brazil, Argentina, Russia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. They weren't seeking short-term contracts. They were building long-term partnerships. The shift wasn't just economic. It was symbolic. For decades, the American Midwest had believed that China's demand for soybeans was a permanent engine of its prosperity. Farmers built new silos, purchased expensive machinery, expanded their lands, believing the market would never disappear. But one morning, the market did, and the world trembled with curiosity. What triggered the sudden break? Behind closed doors in Beijing, the reasoning was straightforward. China no longer wanted to depend on a rival for something so essential to its food security. Soybeans weren't just crops, they were livestock feed, cooking oil, fuel for national consumption, the backbone of the country's food supply. Relying on the United States, a nation increasingly seen as a strategic competitor, was now viewed as a risk too great to tolerate. So China created a plan. First, it sought new global suppliers. Farms in Brazil were modernized with Chinese investments. Tractors in Argentina arrived not from Detroit but from Shenzhen. Zimbabwe and South Africa, eager to expand their agricultural economies, signed contracts that promised decades of steady demand. Even Russia, with its vast land and shorter growing seasons, agreed to restructure its agricultural sector to accommodate soybean production. Then came the domestic move. China unveiled a sweeping program to make soybean farming profitable within its own borders. Northern provinces received new irrigation networks. Scientists in laboratories from Beijing to Harbin engineered high-yield soybean varieties that could thrive in cold climates. Schools and universities began encouraging agricultural careers with incentives that once targeted technology and engineering. The world watched with disbelief as thousands of acres of land once used for less essential crops shifted to soybean cultivation almost overnight. For the first time in history, China set a goal not to import soybeans but to become self-sufficient. The United States didn't take the shift seriously at first. It had seen trade disagreements come and go before. It assumed China would return when global supply tightened or prices rose, but the global supply didn't tighten, it expanded. Brazil and Argentina planted record crops. African agricultural zones became more productive than ever. Russia approved new land allocations for soybean farming across Siberia and the Far East. American soybean shipments remained docked. The economic shockwave spread quickly across the Midwest. Farms that once sold their harvest months in advance suddenly had no buyers. Some tried to pivot to European markets, but European demand could not replace the scale of China. Others sold below cost just to keep going. Families who had run farms for generations looked at empty order sheets and wondered how everything had changed so fast. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, soybean processing plants hummed without a single American shipment. Ships arrived from South America and Africa instead. The cooking oil in markets, the feed in livestock farms, the soy-based products in supermarkets all continued flowing as if nothing had changed. For ordinary citizens, there was no disruption. For the government, there was absolute certainty. China had achieved stability by cutting dependence. The break wasn't fueled by anger. It was driven by strategy. China had watched how the United States used trade as leverage around the world. It had seen economic pressure applied to rivals when political disputes erupted. And it concluded that one day soybeans could be used the same way against them, so it made the move first. If the United States wanted leverage, it now held none. American politicians tried to reverse the damage by offering subsidies, tax incentives, and export credit guarantees. But China wasn't interested. Every time Washington reached out to reopen soybean negotiations, Beijing politely redirected the conversation toward technology, energy, or security cooperation, always avoiding agriculture. Every message was polite, but every refusal was firm. China had built alternatives. The United States had not. That single shift, one crop, one trade relationship rewrote the global map of power. South America became wealthier, Africa's agricultural transformation accelerated. Russia added a new economic weapon to its strategy, and the United States learned that something it assumed was permanent was never guaranteed. The world didn't change loudly, it changed quietly, in ports, in contracts, in fields. The real battles of the 21st century weren't fought with missiles or soldiers, but with supply chains and food security, and the first major victory went to China. The consequences rippled far beyond soybean fields. When China stopped buying, the United States didn't just lose a customer. It lost a strategic assumption. Washington believed for decades that China needed American agriculture more than America needed Chinese demand. That belief had shaped negotiation styles, foreign policy confidence, and even election rhetoric. But now, with China sourcing soybeans elsewhere and cultivating its own supply, the balance of power inverted. Diplomats in Washington scrambled to turn agriculture into a bargaining chip again, but the world had changed. Nations across Europe, Asia, and Africa noticed how quickly China had reorganized supply chains without relying on the United States. Suddenly, questions arose. If China could detach from American soybeans, could it detach from other American exports too? Could other countries follow that example? Every canceled shipment sent that message more clearly. Meanwhile, in São Paulo, officials celebrated what they called the golden decade of agriculture. Investments from China transformed farmland that once suffered cyclical drought into the most productive soybean region on the planet. Rail lines financed through development deals cut transportation costs by half. New port expansions built with Chinese construction firms processed record freight volumes for the first time in history. Brazil became the undisputed soybean superpower. Argentina followed closely. Its farmland, once choked by debt and unstable currency, suddenly found stability through long-term export guarantees. Argentina knew that as long as the grains were harvested, China would buy. No unpredictable markets, no political ultimatums, no last-minute cancellations. For both sides, it was predictable. Business, and predictable business, meant growth. In Africa, the transformation was even more dramatic when China invested in agricultural infrastructure across Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, and Zambia. Worlds shifted. New irrigation systems turned dry soil into usable farmland. Universities opened agricultural institutes specializing in soybean science. Young farmers who once saw agriculture as a last resort now saw it as a path to wealth. Villages became distribution hubs. Rural roads turned into paved highways. Governments that once depended on mineral exports now had a powerful second economic engine. The United States watched from afar, torn between frustration and disbelief. Farm associations demanded relief, arguing that decades of investment into farmland had been built on the assumption of permanent Chinese demand. Politicians blamed one another for pushing China away. Economists suggested diversifying export markets, but there were no markets large enough to replace China's appetite. Soybeans weren't like electronics or cars that could be sold to hundreds of small buyers. A crop of that scale needed one giant customer, and that customer had moved on. As months passed, the silence from Beijing was the loudest part of the crisis. The United States wanted negotiations. China wanted independence. Inside Chinese agricultural headquarters, the plan advanced to its next phase. Soybean self-sufficiency was no longer the final goal. It was the foundation. The government encouraged companies to create entirely new value chains: soy-based protein industries, livestock feed clusters, biodiesel refineries, and food processing hubs. Soybeans were no longer just crops, they were catalysts for industrial expansion. China communicated none of this publicly. Statements given to international media were calm and vague, expressing an interest in agricultural diversification and mutually beneficial trade opportunities. There was no boasting, no declaration of victory. The strategy wasn't to humiliate the United States. It was to secure China's future, but humiliation happened anyway. The breaking point came during a global trade forum when the United States tried to rally support for renewed agricultural trade pressure on China. Delegates from South America declined. Delegates from Africa firmly refused. Even Russia, often aligned with U.S. agricultural interests in the past, sided with China. For the first time, a motion proposed by the United States regarding global food markets gained almost no international support. The world had chosen a side not out of ideology, but out of opportunity. Back in the Midwest, the crisis changed from economic to cultural. Farmers who once felt proud to feed the world now felt discarded. Schools held meetings about shrinking budgets as agricultural tax revenues collapsed. Equipment dealerships sat quiet, unsold machines lined up behind fences like monuments to a vanished era. A popular saying spread among farming communities: if China leaves, the world leaves. And though it sounded dramatic, it reflected reality. The United States had never prepared for a future without Chinese buyers. The world had never imagined China would willingly walk away from American abundance, yet it had, and the most unsettling part for Washington wasn't the loss of soybean sales. It was the realization that China could possibly and quietly do the same thing with other strategic imports. Microchips, energy, rare earths, high-tech machinery, pharmaceuticals. If soybeans were the test, China had passed and the United States had failed to notice until it was too late. The shockwave had only begun.